Alright guys, welcome to Formula 1 News. Lando Norris on pole for the second weekend in a row, but this time it is not Max Verstappen lining up alongside him. Verstappen with his worst qualifying since Singapore last year, with Red Bull absolutely nowhere in the third part of qualifying today. If this result in qualifying maintained itself tomorrow, we absolutely have a Drivers' Championship fight in our hands. What is going on at Red Bull lately? What has changed? It's so much reaction, especially from Verstappen, because he definitely should be concerned that these championship fights are nowhere near over with what we are currently seeing. Can Red Bull turn this around in the race tomorrow or for the rest of the season? What has happened to get from the start of the season to where we are today? Very much intrigued to your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. This is Kimi Räikkönen in the paddock. Just at the same time as Kimi Antonelli was announced today as Mercedes driver for next season. Interestingly enough, there was some conversation on whether Antonelli is actually named after Kimi Räikkönen. It's believed that Antonelli's father, his friends, was potentially nicknamed based on Kimi Räikkönen. So, you know, and obviously they come from a racing family. I think it's more likely than not that Antonelli gets his name, at least in part, from Räikkönen. It just makes too much sense, I would say, for that not to be the case. But he is going to be driving that Mercedes next year alongside George Russell. It's a fascinating development. Apparently Antonelli will get the number 12. He wants the number 12. Jack Doohan also wants number 12, but apparently Mercedes put in the request first for Antonelli because they've known they were doing this now for some time. So apparently Antonelli's going to get the number that he wants. Obviously it's fascinating, right? I'm so excited to see the grid for next season, right? We're going to have at least 3 rookies on there. Doohan, Behrman, potentially Lawson as well at RB is definitely a possibility. And then Antonelli. Obviously he's going to be a very young raw driver and he's coming in at 18 years of age when Hamilton got his top seat at McLaren back in 2007, which is, you know, pretty much the last time that something like this happens, a rookie going into a top team. He had 10,000 kilometers worth of testing. That's not the case for Antonelli, and Hamilton was 22 years of age. So it's just so exciting, right? And I think that Antonelli has the raw speed that there are certain weekends next season where he is going to be mesmerizingly good and seriously put Russell under pressure, but I think you can expect some inconsistencies. I just think it's fascinating to see such a hyped up prospect, and you can obviously discuss the pressure and whether he should be in a Mercedes or whether he should be in another car, but look, he's clearly convinced Toto Wolff from Mercedes. Every time he gets in the car, he's the man for the job, and if he's convinced Mercedes, that's good enough for me. So it's fascinating, I think. Even Toto Wolff says 5 minutes after Hamilton told him that he's going to Ferrari, he'd made his mind up that Kimi Antonelli was going to be the replacement, which is pretty fascinating just because, now this quote is a joke by the way, he didn't actually say after Max rejected me for the 47th time, but that's the point, right? He's obviously been flirting heavily with Verstappen over the last couple of months, so it did make me wonder if he was so set on signing Antonelli, if Verstappen all of a sudden became available, would Antonelli have stayed on the sidelines, or would it have been Russell who would have gone? And that's the question if you're Russell, right? You have to put Antonelli in the dust next season, because if you don't, and Antonelli's pretty competitive with you, then if Max is available for Mercedes, they're going to keep Antonelli and not Russell, right? And that is the concern that George has to deal with and, you know, cope with for next season, because 3 into 2 don't go. And even Toto Wolff responded to this and said, no, he wants Russell and Antonelli to be the partnership for some time. But obviously, next season is going to determine a lot. So super fascinated for next season. Obviously, his Formula 2 championship isn't going especially swimmingly, but you've got to recognise what he's achieved over the last few years, and these Formula regional championships in Formula 3 machinery, you know, he's won everything, he's impressed everybody, and obviously people are going to be critical both ways, but I just think it's an exciting thing for the sport, especially an Italian driver as well, back on the grid is always nice to see. Quickly on James Vowles, he actually, I think, recognised that he maybe wasn't in the best mood when he made his comments about Mick Schumacher, because even Toto Wolff said, wasn't really necessary, James. Although at the same time, Toto, you know, said, oh, I can't believe, Vowles, that you said Mick Schumacher wasn't special, and then simultaneously doesn't choose Mick to be in the Mercedes, but chooses what he actually believes to be a special talent. And Vowles said that he apologised to Mick for those statements. It came across the wrong way. When he says special, he's talking about the Sennas, or, you know, the Schumachers, the Hamiltons, you know, well, Schumacher, right? Michael, not Mick, shall we say. But, you know, that's what he says. When he says special talent, he's talking of those, world champion drivers such as Senna. And then he says, look, it makes sense what we're doing, promoting a driver from the academy, and fair enough. And Colapinto's been okay. Today, he'll probably come out of the day thinking that he should have done better than he did, and we'll get to that in a second. Bottas is still looking for a seat, by the way. There's lots of debate on this. I'm going to be really gutted if Bottas doesn't have a seat on the grid next season. There's only a couple of seats left. He should definitely be having one of them. Probably the one at Audi makes the most sense, right? Audi, Sauber, alongside Hülkenberg. But they may be looking at Lawson instead. There were a couple of comments on Max today, because you guys remember when Lando, after winning the Dutch Grand Prix, said, "Simply lovely, huh?" on the radio. Even I think Lando commented on that today and said, well, I didn't really think much of it, like it just came to mind, thought it was kind of funny. And Max doesn't get involved in the drama here. Ricciardo said that he'd be annoyed about it and that Lando should be expecting something of a response here. But no, Verstappen says, people talked about that, it is what it is. We've just got to focus on the car getting better. So, fair enough, a mature response there from Max. But then again, I was still expecting, if it was Lando and Max alongside each other for tomorrow's race, some sort of fireworks into turn one. The reality is Max is going to be too far behind, you'd imagine, to do anything against Lando into turn one tomorrow. This also from Ferrari, the classic Ferrari strategy here in Monza, banging in all the new components, right? So Carlos Sainz had brand new turbo internal combustion engine, motor, generator unit for heat and also for kinetic, and the final power unit of the year. So the next one, if they do take one, will incur a penalty, but it's pretty standard procedure really for Ferrari to chuck all the brand new stuff in. Now, the practice session was kind of fascinating really, setting up for qualifying. Mercedes were topping the times again, and their problem on some level of being great in practice and then actually converting that when it comes down to the real qualifying sessions still remained, although they probably had the pace in there somewhere for pole because it was just so competitive today. But even Max on this flying run towards the ends, couple of tenths down on Hamilton's fastest time, and obviously there was a bit of back and forth on the radio here. The most interesting radio conversation though probably was this one, where Verstappen during practice says the car doesn't turn low speed or medium speed. And well, here we go again, right, with Max talking about the car doesn't turn. Now, to be fair, Jos Verstappen even today said that Max also had his complaints about the balance and the turning of the car and everything like that, the rotation through the corners right back at the start of the season. But clearly the complaints weren't as loud back then as they are today. And we've talked about it a lot over the last couple of weeks as to what the reasons here might potentially be for how they've dropped off so far. But I mean, it's almost unfathomable, is it not, how far Red Bull have fallen. There was this interesting moment as well where I think Piastri was probably trying to get out of the way of Ricciardo behind him. He then kind of pushes Leclerc onto the grass. No further action there in the end. But yeah, Max not the greatest lap in practice, saying that his car doesn't really turn as he would like to, and it was Hamilton that topped the timesheets ahead of Russell, ahead of Leclerc, the McLarens just behind. Both Williams looking pretty good as well. Colapinto was within the conversation with Alex Albon, and maybe that would have been the case as well going into qualifying, but of the mistake we shall see in a second. Also interestingly to note in Formula 2 today, the sprint race happened. Ollie Bearman took a very impressive victory. Antonelli would have been possibly in the mix as well, but he had to start further down the grid due to a penalty that he had, and then he had some contact first corners, all sorts of drama. So Antonelli's weekends goes from bad to worse on some level, but he was announced as a Mercedes driver, so it is what it is. But as I said yesterday, right, Bearman got out qualified by Antonelli by a tenth and a half in that qualifying session, and Bearman's really good around Monza, and he proved it today. So interesting for Ollie really, just because he's had a difficult season despite his confirmation for Haas next year, and then kind of out of nowhere just delivers a really stellar race. So just makes, I think, the grid next season even more exciting than it already was. But let's talk about this qualifying session, because here's Carlos Sainz having a massive moment at the second Lesmo. He could have very easily been in the wall here. He had to go full opposite lock to save this one, and if he hadn't have done it, he'd have been at the barriers. Leclerc's lap behind him would have been ruined, and Sainz would have been nowhere near. This, I think, was his first run as well. So Leclerc, of course, was second at that point. Sainz was way down the order after that mistake. He had to go again. That's what he eventually did, putting in a good enough lap time in the end. Mercedes were in an interesting spot though, Q1, because both of them are quite a way off the pace they needed to be. Russell was complaining about the tyres just sliding all over the place, not in the correct temperature window. It has been a problem for Mercedes, and it's not necessarily gone away. So Q1 went on like this, but even here, Verstappen 3/10 off where Norris was with a 19.9 to start out the day. Colapinto was in a position to maybe do some damage, but unfortunately for him, made a mistake on his final run, went super wide, kind of did well again to save the car, but that destroyed his final attempt. And the Williams today had some pace, more pace actually than I expected. Albon did a brilliant job today in qualifying, we'll get to in a second. But look, at least Colapinto didn't put it in the wall, I suppose. This was a big moment as well, with Piastri getting, well, clearly impeding Verstappen in the pit lane for a massively unsafe release. Now, the standard procedure here, the kind of discussion on this is ongoing as I'm recording the video. The standard procedure, this is a fine, a reprimand for the team rather than for the driver, right? So like the team tells the driver when to go, it's not really on the driver this instance. So yeah, the standard procedure here is not a grid penalty. It's a grid penalty if you impede on the track, but if you're impeding coming out of the pits for an unsafe release, that tends to be more so on the team. So I don't think Piastri is going to get a grid penalty, but even if he does, Verstappen's still going to stay where he is, and Norris is still going to stay where he is, which maybe is the important thing at the end of the day. So Colapinto makes that mistake. He's out of qualifying. Both of the Saubers just terrible again. I don't even want to talk about it at this point. Stroll was one of the big casualties. Yuki was out qualified by Ricciardo as well. Ricciardo did a pretty damn good job today, although Yuki did say afterwards that apparently they're both running different setups, so different parts on the car, so maybe that explains some of the difference there. And what we saw at the start of Q2 was pretty representative of how the session was going, really. Leclerc and Sainz both on older tyres, about the same pace as Perez. Verstappen was a tenth and a half off what Norris was doing, and Piastri about a tenth behind. So this was pretty representative, to be fair, what we saw the first runs of Q2 coming through. And then Hamilton, though, he goes P1 with a 1:19.6. So all of a sudden, Mercedes and Hamilton looking to be right back in the fight. In a 19.6, a very competitive lap time at that point in the session, especially because it was early in Q2 with more track improvement to come. Leclerc wasn't happy with the balance of the car again, felt like he had too much understeer. I think he tried a couple of clicks up on his front wing, so a little bit more front downforce going into the final part of qualifying, but that didn't really help him all that much. Hülkenberg and certainly Albon did a great job as they did getting into the final part of qualifying, and Verstappen then put in a good run at the end, and it still felt like Verstappen was in the mix for pole at this point. The car had been not great, but like, let's be honest, Helmut Marko, as we talked about yesterday, said the car's feeling better, it's looking better, certainly in terms of performance in the long run pace and the qualifying sims. It seems like the Red Bull have found a better balance this weekend than they did in Zandvoort. And this is meant to be a good track for Red Bull, right? Let's not forget. I mean, it's a lot of straight lines. It's a lot of, relatively higher speed corners. Okay, a couple of chicanes, but it's a track that Red Bull have crushed in at for the last couple of years. It's not even really been close in many respects, some of the performance levels between the Red Bull and others. And this year, it's obviously such a different story, right? And, Verstappen did, however, still put in a good lap at the end. There was a bit of impeding going on again out of the pit lane, an unsafe release here from Carlos Sainz, but that didn't massively matter again in terms of getting out there. And these were the first runs of the final part of qualifying. Norris at a 1:19.4, Piastri 300ths behind, Russell and Hamilton 300ths apart, Sainz and Leclerc 3,000ths apart, Perez and Verstappen 100th apart. So it was real Noah's Ark here after the first runs in Q3, but obviously you're like, Perez ahead of Verstappen, what's going on? Max had a big moment in the Parabolica and his Sector 3, like his tyres just went away from him. And this was the confusing thing for Red Bull today. It's the same issue that Mercedes have suffered with for parts of this season, when their car looks good, or at least respectable, and all of a sudden it's kind of nowhere. And Verstappen was suffering from that in his first lap. He was pretty quick, Sector 1, Sector 2, but Sector 3 through Ascari through the Parabolica, his rear tyres just went away from him and was just sliding all over the shop, driving on ice, and did not have the performance to get anywhere close. But I thought, okay, probably, when I saw this, I thought, okay, probably Max made a mistake somewhere, and his final run is going to be, a tenth behind, maybe pole or something, and that could be well in the mix. But obviously, that's not what happened at all. Max was on the radio saying I had no grip on this tyre at all, and that was the brand new tyre, right? The run that he did to get, I think, P2 in the second part of qualifying, just behind Hamilton, was on a scrubbed set. I think they'd already maybe done a lap or two on them. So the fact that Max went from being that competitive on an old set to absolutely nowhere on a brand new set was pretty much, shocking, really. And then we had this moment where in the second Lesmo, Perez goes massively wide onto the gravel, destroys his own lap, so he's not going to be able to improve, and then Max then has to drive through that. But even then, like, watching Max's onboard going into the Roger chicane, he was a little bit tentative on the way and had a couple of stabs at it. Through the first Lesmo, bit of understeer. Through the second Lesmo, bit of understeer. The car didn't seem very well balanced through Ascari either. Like, watching Max's onboard and also from above, like, you could quite clearly tell that car was nowhere near as compliant as he wanted on a brand new set of tyres in Q3. So what's going on here, right? We haven't seen this for ages, and Lando Norris puts in a lap that wasn't even that good. He was like, yeah, terrible lap. I'm sorry about that, guys. And they were like, yeah, good enough for pole. Same thing that Max has been saying at times for the last... I mean, that's what Max was saying at the start of the season. He was like, oh, sorry about that, guys. Wasn't a good lap. And GP was like, yeah, that's pole position. That's miles away from being the case today. And with Verstappen struggling massively and ending 7 tenths down on Norris, I mean, let's not forget that time of like a 120.0 was like 4 tenths slower than he did in Q2. So something just went massively wrong. Like, the car was quicker than that. Like, but the potential was faster than that, but it was probably not fast enough for pole anyway. I mean, even if Verstappen's car had have worked, he still would have been maybe P7, maybe P6. It was so competitive up front of that. We'll get into that in a second, discussing the top ones, but this was perfect for McLaren. Like, I said it last week, how if Norris wants to win this Drivers' Championship, Piastri is going to have to be in position to help him, and the fact that they got a 1-2 today, a 10th between them, fantastic for McLaren. Russell ends up third. I was a little bit confused by the Mercedes situation. Hamilton was furious at himself after qualifying, as we'll discuss here in a second, but the default way of doing this, and Mercedes said this themselves, is to have 6 or 7 seconds between your drivers, because everyone talks about the slipstream and giving a tow. It very rarely actually works. Like, the only way that that really ever works is if one of your drivers is getting a grid penalty or something, and you can just get him into Q3 and try and give a tow, because if you try and tow the driver in front, you're always losing more through dirtier in the corners than you gain on the straight. Mercedes know this, and every team typically will set their drivers up like 7 seconds apart, so you get a little bit of a tow through the kind of turbulence in the air in front, but you don't really lose anything at all in the corners at that point. Mercedes, I think, had Hamilton maybe, was he not about 3 seconds behind Russell on track, which is definitely detrimental. So I was a bit surprised by that. Maybe that was Hamilton's doing, maybe that was the team's doing, but I think there was maybe more in that, and Hamilton will feel like for sure pole was a possibility today. The 2 Ferraris were not happy with their laps either, at least in terms of the actual performance and the understeer, and even being a 10th off. I mean, a 10th and a half off was P5, and not even 2 tenths off was P6. So mighty competitive today. Leclerc afterwards was actually pretty furious himself. He says, you know, I'm pissed off. This car is so bad in the slow speed corners. So pretty harsh words for a guy a 10th and a half off. But Ferrari wanted the win this weekend. So they wanted the pole. And despite being close, obviously, you know, close but no cigar, Hamilton was very frustrated. He actually made this comment: the team deserved better. Maybe they'll get that with Kimi. He's obviously been very harsh and honest, you know, with himself on his performance in qualifying, and he even said this: I'm furious because I could have been pole. I think I could have been at least on the front row. I didn't do the job in the end, lost a 10th and a half into turn 1, turn 2, lost another 10th in the last corner. But as I say, I feel like the gap between Russell and Hamilton there was probably not optimal, but like he says, qualifying's been a weakness. It is interesting to see this from Hamilton, because it's obviously like he's got the pace clearly, like he's doing it in the other qualifying sessions, but it seems like that execution in Q3 just hasn't really been there this season. And look, he's going to keep trying. At the end of the day, the championship isn't going to happen. He's just trying to win as many races as he can at this point, and it doesn't look like that's going to happen tomorrow. But then again, McLaren again are the heavy favourites regardless. I mean, Max was on the radio saying, I don't know what happened there. My car just didn't work at all in Q3. No grip at all. And then Max says it's a very difficult car to drive, very difficult to find a good balance in it. You've got one issue, you try and fix it. You've got another issue. Q2 wasn't too bad. Q3 was bad again on a new set of tyres, and we've just not really seen that at all. Max even was asked the question, Lando's on pole, he's catching you in the championship, he can gain lots of points, and Max is like, well, clearly he's not very happy as you look at his face. Yeah, we can thank ourselves for that, and is just a bit confused why his car didn't turn. Turn 1, turn 4 is actually the corners that I mentioned, kind of like the car did not decide to work anymore in the final part of qualifying. So this is now the situation, right? Lando is going to start P1 for tomorrow tomorrow's race. Assuming that McLaren can convert, they have no problems, and they convert the 1-2, or at least they convert the Lando victory, Verstappen might have a difficult time overtaking around here. The Red Bull doesn't have any crazy top speed this weekend as it maybe has done previously. The chances of him getting stuck in a train with the Mercedes, the Ferraris, the McLarens is pretty damn likely, I'm not going to lie. It's challenging to overtake around here. We know that to be true historically as well. Lando might be able to just check out and win. Let's say Max ends up P7 or P5 or maybe P4, something like that tomorrow, especially if he doesn't make the podium. That's a big potential point swing, and assuming it's P1, P7, then this would be your Drivers' Championship with only 51 points with 8 races to go, at which point the championship is surely absolutely on based on what we are currently seeing. That requires McLaren to execute, and also I think it requires McLaren to have a conversation with themselves on exactly how they manage their team. Zach Brown mentioned this after being pressured by Nico Rosberg to answer it. He was like, look, you're in a constructors fight, which you're probably going to win. You're in a drivers fight, which you still potentially could win. If, let's say, Lando doesn't have a great start tomorrow and Oscar gets into turn 1 first, McLaren absolutely have to, at some point in the race, get them to invert the cars, because if they do what they did in Hungary again now, because, oh, well, we have 2 number 1 drivers, like, I will not be impressed. To be honest, I will not be impressed. And I think they will do that if it necessitates. But if Lando gets a good start, then they should be absolutely fine. And maybe Piastri can be defending for Norris rather than fighting him for position. But, of course, that will only happen depending on what we see at turn 1 and off the line tomorrow. So, massively intrigued to your thoughts on all of this stuff in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care. And I'll see you next time.